So I want to repeat something that was said before, is that what I really don't want to end up with a report that says, here are the 15 narrow research topics, and then for CDC to say, well, these are the research topics that we'll give money for, because I really think that science is advanced by much more by investigator-initiated topics than by topics sent down. So I really like the NIJ approach in this most recent round. I want to also echo what has been said a lot before, is about the importance of having good data. The National Violent Death Reporting System, for example, will have an article out soon which says, here are some of the things we've already learned from this data system, even though it's only been in 18 states. One of the things, for example, that we've learned is that the data from death certificates, the Whiskers data that you can find easily at the CDC, gives very inaccurate information about unintentional firearm deaths, that unintentional firearm deaths are to much younger people than it is assumed to be. We also think it's really important for the CDC to really take its mission seriously about gun violence, and to make sure that in its data sets, such as the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System and the YRBS and the sexual assault data systems, that they have gun questions, which are often currently not there. One of the things I also just in background want to emphasize is that it's not only government that should make sure that they are collecting good information about guns, but it's also private researchers. One of my goals in life is to add injury questions to other people's surveys, and I've been really successful in that in lots of areas, especially about injury generally, but sometimes about guns because of political climate. People are afraid to add gun questions to their surveys, which is terrible. Also, as background, I was really trying to figure out, I, like Phil Cook, took seriously the requirements for this, which was to have 3 research questions, and I kept coming up with research questions which belonged, I thought, in other research breakout groups. So since I had them here, let me just talk them for a second. To make sure they get on somebody's radar if they're not. One is about gun taxes. What would be the effect of increasing gun taxes? Does it make any sense to do this? What about gun insurance? Can we use the insurance system at all to affect gun violence? One is about prohibition of when a gun owner becomes a prohibited owner, what is the most effective way to take the gun away if you really want to do that? Also, sort of stepping back, what I initially thought my 3 questions would be about is, say we had a country which is actually really interested in prevention, and everyone was interested in prevention. What could different groups do? For example, what could we hope that gun manufacturers would really do that they're not doing? What would gun distributors really do if their goal was to reduce gun violence? What could we expect from FFLs, and what could we expect from private sellers? And also, of course, what could we expect gun owners to do if their goal was to prevent violence? But instead, I think our focus here is the characteristics of gun violence, though it's hard to focus just on that. So in the 3 priorities, and I want to argue that these 3 things, this one is maybe just priority 1. I can't decide if it's 1, 2, or 3. We really need to know, I think, a whole lot more about, people have talked about this already, about self-defense gun use. I want to mention also about gun use in deterrence, private gun ownership, and then a little bit about gun intimidation. So as background, at Harvard, we've sponsored over time 3 national random digit dial surveys of averaging about 2,300 to 2,400 respondents, asking a lot of questions about self-defense gun use. We also added a lot of questions on a state survey about self-defense gun use. There have been other private surveys, and of course the National Crime Victimization Survey gives some information. Right now, I think we don't know nearly as much about self-defense gun use as we should. The National Academy of Sciences said we really need a good definition, since there is no definition. It seems to be right now, all the information we have, it's sort of what self-defense gun use is sort of self-defined by the respondent. Don't know nearly enough about the circumstances of self-defense gun use. One of the things that we did on our surveys, which was not commonly done, is that we not only asked lots of questions about the self-defense gun use, but we also asked an open-ended question, which was, tell us about what happened in your own words. We know that from psychology that there really are problems with social desirability responses or self-presentation bias that people will tend to make themselves look in a favorable light. But when we heard these verbatim accounts of the self-defense gun uses, we were really shocked because they weren't nearly as compelling as we would have thought. Indeed, when we sent these verbatim accounts to people in criminology and said, what do you think? Is this beneficial to society or detrimental to the social welfare, to social safety? The large majority of these specific self-defense gun uses were categorized by these people in criminology as detrimental to the social interests. So they were mostly escalating arguments. A typical instance would be that here I am, I'm sitting on my porch and my neighbor comes over and we start to arguing and he throws a beer at me and I run into my house and get my gun. Or we were in a park and we were drinking and we started arguing and we ran to our cars and got our guns. We also sent these to 5 criminal court judges that we knew from friends of acquaintances and asked them in their state, would this be legal? If the gun was owned legally, if the gun was carried legally, and if the story was exactly correct, even though this was only one side of a hostile interaction. And the majority said that about a little over 50% of these would be declared illegal in their states at that time. We need to know a lot more about things like, if you lock up your gun, does this really prevent the likelihood of most self-defense gun uses, or few or almost none? Does this reduce the likelihood that you'll be able to protect yourself, and in what situations and how often? We need to know more about the effects of training on self-defense gun use. Does training actually make you shoot straighter? Does it actually make you, does it protect you or not in self-defense situations? Does it teach you how to de-escalate arguments, or does it teach you in effect how to escalate arguments? We need to know more about home invasions. We're in the process of using the National Crime Victimization Survey to find out more about home invasions in which someone was killed. We need to know more about the exact situations of justifiable homicides and excusable homicides, and of course, as mentioned, stand your ground law homicides. And then the aftermath, anecdotally, various people, reporters actually have told me of talking to people who have used guns in self-defense and shot someone, and it seems like it has an incredibly traumatic effect on them. And we want to see, is this really true or not? Related to this is the whole notion of deterrence, which we know very, very little about. Do private guns really deter crime? In what circumstances? When does it deter crime? When doesn't it deter crime? Is this a big effect? Is it a small effect? There's always sort of this fear that if people have guns, this may make criminals, this may just increase the arms race, and criminals will more likely arm themselves, and is this a big problem or a little problem? In the Cook-Ludwig study, where they found that where there was, in counties where there was more guns, there seemed to be more burglaries rather than fewer burglaries, and they claimed that perhaps, they suggested perhaps it's because burglars find guns, that's something they really want to steal, and is this really true, and is it a problem? People have always wanted to look at, if you have a gun, does this really change your behavior? If you're carrying a gun, does this make it more likely you'll put yourself in a more dangerous situation, increasing the likelihood that you have to use your gun? And we seem to know very little about that. And finally, at least on the internet, a lot of gun owners seem to be claiming that without the Second Amendment, we have no First Amendment, and that guns really are things which are what is preserving our democracy, and that the gun owners are the ones that will determine whether or not the government should be overthrown, and this is maybe a deterrent to a coup d'etat or whatever, which I don't understand, but I think we need a good historian to go through and understand across lots of countries to the extent where gun ownership really protects democracy or might be a threat to democracy. A third related thing I want to just mention is hostile gun displays. Again, from our national random digit dial surveys of self-defense use, a lot of these self-defense gun uses seem to have been situations where the other party could have said someone was aggressively using a gun against me and I'm the victim. What else we also did on all these surveys is we asked, has anyone used the gun in a hostile manner against you in the past year? And we found out huge numbers of people, many more people said yes to that question than when asked, have you used the gun in self-defense in the past year? And so some of the examples of these were people would say things like, I was in my car and I was at a stoplight and the car pulled up next to me and they opened the window and somebody pointed their gun at me and laughed. And that's not something I think that would typically get into the National Crime Victimization Survey. Or we were walking down the street and somebody on the other side yelled at us and we yelled back and he raced over to us with his gun and said, did you say something? Did you say something? And they said no. And this sort of notion of intimidation and menacing with guns seems to be much more common than I would have thought and hasn't been picked up, I don't think, again, by the National Crime Victimization Survey. And we seem to know almost nothing about these kind of incidents except which was we found in our surveys. The second thing I want to talk about in terms of where I'd like to see more research is in just dividing up gun violence by place. I really am interested, even though I know nothing about it, does it make sense to have guns in convenience stores? What's the evidence? Is it they often used? If they're not used, if someone steals something and you have a gun versus you don't have a gun, what's the likelihood of this being a smart tactic to either have a gun or to use it in jewelry stores and convenience stores and taxis and so forth? I don't think we know very much about what school research officers really do. My understanding, talking to a number of principals, is that it doesn't seem to matter whether they're armed or not. What seems to matter is whether they're good social workers. And basically, if they're good social workers, they figure out nonviolent ways to resolve conflicts, and that's their major use rather than being there to shoot someone. I think we need to certainly know more about gun violence in the home, gun violence on the street. Does it make sense from the point of view of the gun owner? If you're carrying a gun, does that make you more or less safe? Does that make the community more or less safe? And I think we don't know nearly enough about that. And finally, I know Jan will talk about this a little, and Matt's talked about it. And it's been talked about, I think, by someone else even, but we just think suicide is so important. And we hear rumors that the CDC is not going to focus very much on suicide at all, and we think that's a huge mistake. We know some stuff about suicide, but we clearly need to know a lot more. It'd be really nice to know a lot more. We need to know a little more about substitution, about if you're going to substitute, what are you going to substitute with, or aren't you going to substitute at all, and in what circumstances, and who is likely to substitute, and so forth and so on. We really want to know a little more. There's some evidence that storage matters, but does it just matter for everybody or in particular situations? Is there some triggering effect of guns? There's some literature. I don't understand how good it is because it's really psychology about the triggering effect of guns may have on aggression. Is there any possible triggering effect of guns or not on suicide? We need to know a lot more about how to change social norms about guns and suicide. We know that gun ranges sometimes, or a few of them, are trying to do something. Does that make any sense or not? Gun retailers are trying to do things, physicians, mental health providers, and so forth are trying to put a wedge between guns and gun suicide, and is this effective or isn't it? But I think this is getting a little bit off the topic of what this is, which is about the characteristics of gun violence, but I'm not sure. But anyway, those are my three major areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And now we'll hear from Jan Vernick, who is the co-director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Policy and Research, where he's an associate professor at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. And he's also the deputy director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Injury Research and Policy.